Well, Briahna, what's on your radar?
Well, it looks like a disaster over in Congress for Democrats. The statistics analysts over at 538 are putting their chances of Republicans flipping the House at more than 70%. The reason voters are choosing to go right? Well, polls show that inflation is voters' top priority, and Republicans are perceived to be more able to bring inflation down than Democrats. When asked, who do you trust more to fight inflation? Voters say the GOP by more than 19 points, according to an ABC Washington Post poll. So before we throw our hands up jubilantly, thrilled that the adults in the room will finally get a crack at bringing down the rising price of goods and services, it's worth asking, what is the Republican plan to fight inflation? Well, Bloomberg's Jack Fitzpatrick did the work of interviewing a number of Congress members who are likely to lead the House Budget Committee if conservatives take back control. What did they say? Well, they plan to cut retirement and health care programs. Specifically, according to a recent piece by New York Mag's Eric Levitz, Republicans plan to refuse to raise the debt ceiling this fall, thereby blocking funding for the federal government and its workers, unless Biden agrees to cut Social Security and Medicare. In the words of Representative Buddy Carter of Georgia, quote, "Our main focus has got to be non-discretionary. It's got to be on entitlements." Representative Jody Arrington of Texas's 19th District explained that he wants eligibility reforms, meaning raising the eligibility age for Medicare and imposing a means test for Social Security and Medicare benefits. Representative Lloyd Smucker of Pennsylvania co-signed this plan, saying some sort of means testing is on the table. So what does that mean for you? Well, let's start with Medicare cuts. 18.4% of the country is covered by Medicare, a program to provide health care for the elderly, people over 65, with blue California and red Florida hosting the most Medicare recipients in the country. Medicare, in its current form, is one of the most popular programs in the country, which explains why Republicans haven't exactly been screaming from the rooftops about their plan to cut it. Meanwhile, 25% of the country receives Social Security, a program, of course, for retirees and the disabled. Without Social Security, the poverty rate for these groups, for those over 65 rather, would exceed 40%, and about a quarter of all states. In about a quarter of all states, poverty would exceed 40% without this program. States like Alabama, Arkansas, Florida, Georgia, Louisiana, Mississippi, Tennessee, and West Virginia. Red states with representatives who arguably aren't looking out for the best interest of their precarious constituents. In fact, when you examine Republican messaging closely, you see that their strategy has largely been to avoid talking about their actual plans and to instead focus on what Biden and the Democrats have done wrong to cause inflation. Namely, they say, COVID-era spending. But here's the problem for Republicans. That spending, which conservatives now blame for high inflation, was in fact very popular even among their constituents. So conservatives are choosing to criticize spending broadly without doing two important things. One, they fail to point out what COVID spending specifically they would have shut down. And two, they rarely explain why America's COVID relief is allegedly the driver of inflation, when inflation is similarly high or higher in nearly every other peer country. Would a Republican House have torpedoed the child tax credit, which 59% of Americans and 41% of Republicans backed? It certainly seems likely, given that 0 Republicans voted for that program, a program which, by the way, disproportionately paid out to Republican states. Would Republicans have voted down the popular $1,400, wasn't enough, but $1,400 COVID relief checks, or the supercharged unemployment benefits, which were supported by 67% of Americans? It seems likely, since those popular provisions received 0 votes from Republicans in the House. And here's the important question. Would America be better off if those things hadn't happened? Certainly, there was quite a bit of pork in the American Rescue Plan that I would have liked to see cut. Most of the PPP funds went to the richest 20% of Americans, while small businesses went bankrupt. Kanye West, no longer a billionaire for other reasons, received PPP loans, as did the Church of Scientology and way too many country clubs. COVID aid included $366 billion for the wealthy, but it seems unlikely that under Republican control, that spending would have necessarily been curbed. After all, Marjorie Taylor Greene benefited from over $183,000 in PPP forgiveness. Matt Gaetz had nearly $500,000 forgiven. And you can add Congressman Markwayne Mullin, Kevin Hearn and Mike Kelly to the list. They all had between $1 and $1.4 million forgiven under that program. So again, in a Republican-led Congress, it looks like we might expect less spending, that is, less spending on the poor, and potentially as much or more spending on the rich. What will that do for inflation? Look, it simply is not clear that cutting spending on basic social programs that have supported the elderly and sick for over half a century would have a measurable effect on inflation. As Bernie Sanders and others have pointed out, inflation rates in the United States are comparable to the rates experienced in our peer countries because a significant driver of inflation has been the supply chain crisis triggered by the COVID pandemic and shutdowns. The Republicans who conspired with corporate Dems to ship American jobs overseas are now trying to punish American voters, trying to get by stripping away their Medicare and Social Security, rather than dealing with the consequences of moving essential goods and services halfway around the world to save a buck. Democrats aren't faultless here, but they have tried to end tax breaks for companies that outsource jobs. Republicans blocked them. Republicans literally blocked an amendment called Stop Outsourcing of American Jobs Amendment back in 2017. Is that what we can expect from a Republican-led House? And I haven't even addressed corporate greed, which experts say is a significant driver of inflation. Companies are taking advantage of the supply crisis and are jacking up prices. It's why the price of gas at the pump isn't connected to the price per barrel. The record profits corporations are seeing while the rest of the country is struggling aren't coming from nowhere. Are Republicans who completely failed to acknowledge this particular driver of inflation likely to hold corporations accountable? Now, in case you think I'm being too unfair to Republicans with respect to their inflation plans, Eric Levitz reports that last June, a conservative caucus of more than 3/4 of House Republicans, called the Republican Study Committee, released a domestic budget plan that calls for raising the Medicare eligibility age to 67 and the Social Security eligibility age to 70. It backed withholding payments to those who retired early and had earnings over a certain limit. And it promoted a Social Security privatization plan. Are you ready for the private banks to gamble with your retirement? How did that go with your mortgage back in 2008? This plan stands to be unpopular with Republicans and Democrats alike on its face, but you haven't heard much about it because the conservative press didn't cover the fact that the whole Republican strategy involves making life harder for seniors who are already struggling to get by. Instead, they framed it as a culture war plan. Quote, GOP budget proposal seeks to reverse decades of anti-family policies, announced the Daily Caller. It's making retirement unaffordable for grandma, pro-family. GOP budget proposal will return us to Cold War footing to counter China threat, is how the National Review characterized the plan. So much for the anti-war right. Does war spending not count toward inflation? Exclusive Republican Study Committee creates holistic immigration plan to raise wages, grow middle class, announced Breitbart. See, I thought the whole point of America First rhetoric was to save money to help Americans first, not to keep out immigrants at the same time that Americans are pinched for the last few pennies they've got. I've said this a million times on this show, but I hope it's clear how cultural commitments are being used to whitewash harsh cuts to the American way of life. Putting aside for a moment your feelings on immigrants or what might be perceived as anti-family cultural preferences on the left, childcare is pro-family. Elder care is pro-family, quite literally. These popular bedrock policies are on the chopping block, and almost nobody knows. You have to ask yourself, is owning the libs worth working until you're 70?
Oh, I have many objections today.
All right, hit me, Robbie.
Well, you're complaining in the middle part of your radar, I think totally fairly, about people like Kanye West and a bunch of wealthy Republicans getting COVID money. Right, I don't support giving them COVID money, but that would essentially mean means testing it, which is what you were complaining about in the beginning. Means testing means not giving people who don't need welfare or social support, only giving it to the people who need it, which is what I would advise doing for these programs like Medicare and Social Security.
So what I would advise doing is simply raising the taxes on the rich. Because look, means testing is very difficult for all the reasons we saw, I forget what the number was exactly, but like millions of dollars are being spent to means test, to pay for the means testing for student debt relief, when you could simply implement a wealth tax that would capture earnings over a certain amount and claw them back, instead of doing it and putting the onus on poor people to prove exactly how poor and needy they are. And I'm glad you raised that, because this is an issue with Social Security as well. If you are Kanye West, if you are a millionaire or a billionaire, you are contributing the amount that comes out of your income towards Social Security caps at a relatively low amount. So someone paying $50,000 or $100,000 a year, or making $100,000 a year rather, is being taxed at a not dissimilar rate in terms of how much money is going to Social Security as Bill Gates. And that cap was put on, advocated for by corporatists who obviously wanted to limit how much they paid into the Social Security system. If they still had 6% of their income being taken out and then going into the Social Security coffers like everybody else, it would absolutely fund the program. And in July,
they're still putting in tons more money.
It doesn't matter. There are 3 people in the world who have more wealth than the bottom half of human population.
They're contributing more in taxes to
but
anyone in the. Yes,
they are. That's
in dollar amounts, they are. Not as a percentage of their income, because their income is vast, but in dollar amounts, they are.
That's tantamount to an argument that says, if I have $1 million and you have $10, you giving $10 to charity and me giving into $100 to charity makes me a good guy. It's about proportion.
It means if I give 1% of my income, it's $1, and if they give 1% of their income, it's thousands.
That's the point. They're not giving 1% of their income. They're not. So over a certain amount, they no longer have to pay that whatever, I'm forgetting the exact number, percent of their income that goes into the Social Security coffers. That's the whole point. They have an artificial cap. Imagine if you're a $50,000 earner a year and somebody else has a $200,000 earner a year, but we decided for some reason that anybody who makes over $100,000, there's a maximum amount they have to contribute to Social Security. That's the world we live in, where the richest people in the world have said, after a certain amount, it's fine. Even though you have all of these employees who are earning minimum wage salaries and aren't able to get by,
I have no desire
you're making
to
profits hand over
punish
fist.
people for succeeding.
It's not
and
about
confiscate
punishing
more
them.
of their wealth.
Telling someone
their wealth.
Why is it that people constantly characterize rich people having to pay their fair share, a rich person having to pay the exact same tax rate as a poor person, as somehow punishing a rich person? Are rich people fragile that they
I don't lust to confiscate poor people's money either.
It's not.
They should just pay nothing.
But you do lust to confiscate poor people's money, because the Republican plan here is to confiscate money, draw back money from some of the only bedrock programs that keep entire quarters of the country from being at a 30% poverty rate.
If all of it, or as close to all of it as you possibly can, what you make on your own. It's your money. But going back to what you're saying, would you then support changing Medicare in such a way that so it used to be true that older people were no longer working, were poor, needed the benefits of Medicare. Now we have, frankly, a lot of old people are very wealthy. Obviously not all old people, but shouldn't the program just be changed in a way that so people who can't pay, so it should be a program for people who can't pay for medical care, don't have insurance, whatever it is, rather than just a program automatically for old people, which is in effect mean testing.
So you want to take people, you want people to not be able to take advantage of a Wait a minute. Let me ask the question.
Okay.
You want people to not be able to take advantage of a program that is not means tested, and instead maintain a kind of means testing for the rich. Instead of having the rich pay their fair share into a program which would make it sustainable, which again is a plan that has been introduced by Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren last summer. Instead of simply asking rich people to pay the same percentage of their income into the program that everybody else has to pay, which would make the program sustainable, instead of simply taxing it on that end, you want another means-tested hurdle where people have to fill out more paperwork to prove they're poor enough to take advantage of the program that they need to survive when they're elderly.
I think our welfare program should benefit the truly needy. I would restructure them to help people who need the support of the state and the taxpayers.
What is the objection to simply clawing that money back from rich people on the back end instead of putting the onus on poor people to fill out that form on the front end? Because right now, only a fraction of people who actually qualify for welfare benefits for all of these social safety benefits actually take advantage of these programs, because there are real barriers to people accessing them. That is just true. So knowing that's the case, and knowing that life is harder for poor people, especially elderly people, you would prefer that elderly people take have to jump through that hoop instead of just doing the same payroll tax that the rest of us have to pay, coming out of our salaries to support Social Security? Why shouldn't Bill Gates have to pay that exact same tax?
I would just not have to do that either. I've only gotten to like 6 of my 30 objections to the things you said. As we would get into the child care and other things, I would legalize child care. Let's legalize it. Let's
What do you mean?
Stop credentialing it, stop all the requirements in DC. I've talked about this repeatedly on the show. The requirements put on people to just babysit your kids are insane and are very difficult for working families, for everyone. Let's legalize work in this country again. Let people work. Bring down the cost of everything.
So in the context of a pandemic emergency, your response wouldn't have been to give people money to help them support the child care facilities that already exist and have been vetted and are safe and don't have pedophiles working at them and have people
now we're going to fearmonger about...
Well, I'm sorry.
Marjorie Taylor Greene over here. Pedophiles everywhere
I didn't say pedophiles are everywhere, but they certainly do exist. And I think a lot of people with children would blanch at the idea. Look, there are informal child care networks that people take advantage of because they have to, and people rely on their family and things like that. But in the context of the pandemic, you would not have supported the child tax credit. I respect that position. Majorities of Americans did support it and did want it, and Republicans are going to have to.
Never argue with popular. I do not claim my views are.
Republicans are going to have to contend with the reality of the fact that they're supporting these politicians who, frankly, are completely out of step with what they say on paper they actually want for themselves and their families.
I think I've gotten to number 7, but I'm being told we have to wrap. So we will continue this discussion at a later date. More Rising right after this.